Well, firstly, thank you to Charlie and the team for hosting this. Just sort of an intro of myself and what CCRU is. So first of all, I'm not an expert in coastal hazards or climate science or anything like that. I'm, well, a software maker as my day trade, but have been involved in CCRU from the beginning. So CCRU stands for Canterbury Coastal Residents United, and it was started exactly about 13 years ago when it became apparent about what the plan change was going to mean for the coastal suburbs, which was essentially to stop building in them. And I'll go into that and the history of it further. So CCRU is really an advocacy group for coastal residents to try and get fair and equitable planning outcomes as we go through this coastal hazards process. And as I was saying, it's been rumbling on since 2013, and we're about to go into the next phase of it. So the objective of tonight's meeting is, well, threefold really. One is to just give you an overview, understanding the history, so you know something about it. The other one is to hear from you. We're really quite interested to hear what people's concerns are and get people talking about their concerns. And the third one is really to ask for help. It takes quite a lot of time to read these documents and engage with people, and we've got quite a few people working from South Shore, New Brighton, so forth, Redcliffe, but we don't actually have really anybody involved from Sumner, so it would be really fantastic if you've got some time and some expertise and would like to help to come and say hi at the end and join up and help us sort of work with the council on this. One sort of thing that came up and comes up quite often at the last, we actually did this once before, and the reason we're doing it again is because I mucked up the recording, so we put a recording on the website for people that can't come. And we hear it quite a bit as like, they're not listening to us, you know, why aren't they listening to us? It comes up over and over again, like as residents talking to council, why aren't they doing what we're telling them? And at the time I sort of said, well, you know, if you want to make decisions, you run for council and then you can, because in a democracy, that's how it works. You vote on council members and they make decisions on your behalf. And so democracy is a really wonderful thing, but it's quite complex, and to make it work, you actually have to use it. And it kind of goes back to what we're trying to do tonight, is to get people to talk about what they're concerned about. So if you don't tell your representatives what you're concerned about, they can't actually really represent you. And if you tell them what you're concerned about and they do nothing, well, you can actually get new ones in 3 years' time. So it's how the system works, and it's how you need to operate to actually, you know, get what you want, so to speak. So I do encourage you to talk about think about what you're concerned about. If you know, and if it's not tonight, talk to Charlie. And I think this is sort of starting a conversation on this. So just to start off, the history of this whole thing. Now I've got a clicker. This is new for me.
Everyone's happy with that. We might just dim the lights, actually, because it makes us feel a lot easier to see. Everyone's happy with that. Is that all right? Yeah.
Is that good? All right, okay. So it all started back in 2013 with the Tonker and Taylor release of the effects of sea level rise report. You possibly remember this. It was a big thing at the time. Now, I've put a wee disclaimer there. This is from memory, but essentially you got this graph of a lot of sea level rise over the next 100 years. So what they did in summary was the assumption of a 1 metre sea level rise over 100 years, add to that a 1 in 500 year flood event, and on top of that add a 16% rain increase, and then a 1 in 50 year high tide event. And I think it may have also had to have happened in the middle of the night to count as being risk to life, because if you're tucked up in bed and this event happens, then there's a higher risk to life than it happened during the daytime. So this again is from memory, so it might need to be checked a little bit, but I think it's reasonably accurate. So what happens is you put these assumptions into a computer model, and this is what you get out of it. An awful lot of area flooded. So the zones that were flooding, if this happened, reached literally all the way into Lancaster Park. And you see South Shore, Sumner, Redcliffs all completely covered. So the one very big change from what we have today is the metre sea level rise. Ooh, we don't want that. Sorry about that. You have to turn off your phones, everybody. I thought I did that.
So can I just ask, I'm unclear where the shading is for the inundation.
Yeah, so if you look at these pink areas,
Okay.
so all around here, and Sumner right back up, basically right to the back of Sumner, South Shore right to the dunes.
And what's the green?
I have no idea,
Right.
actually. What is the green? It's not green space, is it? Maybe it is. Could be. No, it's not. I have no idea.
Maybe that's erosion.
Yes. Maybe. No, I don't think so. Not that either. The point I will make here is, apart from showing you the areas that would have been affected under these scenarios, this is now 2016 and the release of the Token and Taylor report. And there's three elements to these hazards. One is flooding, the other one's erosion, the other one's inundation. So with the sea level rise, you get flooding, erosion, inundation, and that's possibly what the green and the pink are about, but they're largely sort of covering similar, particularly flooding and inundation. So these are the three hazards we need to think about with this. Now, this is another really key point in time and a bit of a sore point, I would say. In July 2015, the independent hearing panel commences stage one, where the 1 metre sea level rise definition went through and was passed unopposed. And this was it should have been challenged to have really proper due process. Sarah at the time actually submitted that the 1 metre was extreme, but didn't actually oppose it. And the communities just didn't really know about it. It was being fast-tracked through in the earthquake legislation, and no one really showed up. And the reason for that was they didn't really know the impacts of it at the time. It was just like we were making this assumption 1 metre sea level rise, but there was no information about the area of land that would be covered, and that the planning response was going to be non-compliance. So it sort of just quietly went through. And I've put the new floor level slide in here. Hey Sarah, welcome. Showing, so that's where the minimum floor levels come from, was that at that point. So this is actually a headline from a newspaper. It's not quite accurate. So government overrides City Council and dumps sea level rise hazards overlays from the district plan fast track process. So the argument was basically that there was a fast track plan going through after the earthquakes, but sea level rise sort of hazards weren't relevant to that because they're a very long-term thing, and we had time to work it out properly, and it should be done under normal planning processes. So the erosion and the inundation were taken out of those three hazards, but unfortunately, I would say, flooding was left in. So we ended up going through the fast track process over this anyway. So this is quite a kind of pivotal moment in the timeline as well. Now, another little really interesting thing for Sumner was that Sumner was removed from the flooding overlay at that time. And there's a link to the evidence behind that. And I would recommend people from Sumner or somebody from Sumner looking into that to see if you would be removed from the current overlays on the same basis. But after that, Sumner didn't really have to worry about any of this because they weren't in it anymore.
Warwick, what was the basis that Sumner was removed from the flooding overlay?
Yeah, so I can give you a kind of a summary and a non-expert one. You've really got to look at that evidence properly. But in essence, it was about water velocity. So to be high hazard, as I understand it, again, not an expert, to be high hazard, it's got to be 1 metre of depth of water or a certain flow velocity, and I think it's 1 metre per second. Yeah. So it's either or of those things, as I understand it. So they obviously thought that there wasn't that flow velocity here in Sumner, or I think from reading the evidence myself, the measurements just weren't. It's actually a bit vague. The evidence, to be honest, is quite vague, I think. But again, I think it's, in general, it's about that flow velocity. But the question mark of water depth is still out there, which is a kind of a question mark. I don't think the foreshore along front of Sumner is not higher than what it might be in Redcliffs or Brighton, for example. So I'm just not sure that someone should look into that. So that's why things have been kind of quiet here in a way, and again, something to look into. So this is where I think CCRU would have come into it. Oh no, sorry. So this is the natural hazards hearing. So remember, for Redcliffs and the rest of the areas in this, the council proposed non-compliance, and that went to the hearings panel in 2016. So I'm guessing most people won't know what building non-compliance means. So I'll sort of explain it. In essence, it means you can't build. And they will say that you need a resource consent, but it's extremely difficult to get a resource consent because there's a thing called a 104 gateway test, which is quite hard to pass because the policy is to stop building and you can't be against the policy. So it's a bit of a circular argument. So in essence, for simplicity's sake, you can really take that as being extremely difficult / impossible to build, and some other people might have something to say about that, but I think that's a fairly fair summary. So CCRU was at that panel, the independent hearing panel, and really argued the case that was too severe. And actually, the non-compliance did get through for commercial building, so you can't really build commercial building in these areas. And so what was called the residential unit overlay was established. So the panel basically agreed and created this thing called the residential unit overlay, which was put in areas that would be affected by sea level rise. And in the residential unit overlay, you're able to build providing you meet certain criteria about mitigating hazards. And that was viewed as a good outcome. Now, Sumner's not in the residential unit overlay because it was not part of that process. So that's something else to bear in mind with this as well. It's sort of another thing in the mix. There's been so many little side roads in this process, and this is one of them. There was a drafting error that meant the residential unit overlay wasn't able to be used. It's kind of crippled in a way. It couldn't be implemented, and either no one noticed, or if they noticed, no one said anything in the period where you could get the plan change. And so we got sort of a couple of years down the track and people weren't able to build, and you saw these news stories like this where this guy has got a section and it's good for grazing a goat. And we sort of got eventually to the bottom of it and found that the planners couldn't use the RUO. So there was also quite an interesting case in Redcliffs where someone took their building to a panel of commissioners, and they were looking at this and basically found this problem in the RUO as well. And basically you have a thing where people were meant to build, but because of the way it was written, it essentially became avoidance, a strict avoidance. So it was kind of absurd and obviously not right. There was quite a kerfuffle around this thing, but I put this in because up until then, I would say it was really, you could sort of say this was a battle against council, and I sort of don't like that term very much, but council was quite resolute about non-compliance of building and really pushed that quite hard. But with this, there was sort of a change at this time, I detect, where sort of council kind of changed, and actually everybody got together and fixed the RUO. So the council, the ECAN, the residents. So they actually corrected the plan and had to go to the minister to get a change made. And since that time, I would say the whole thing's been a lot more collaborative and healthier. You've still got a very hard problem to solve, and I would say from my experience and what I hear is the council still sees that very high sea level rise as likely. Everybody's got different opinions, but I think the kind of approach now is, well, let's see what we can do, let's work it out. It's quite a different attitude, and I think a lot more care has been taken now as we go through this. It's just my perspective from a distance, I would say. So where are we going with this? And so we haven't really had the hazard planning. This new process that's happening now hasn't gone through, but there's some things been happening ahead of it, which might give us a bit of an idea of where we're going. So some people wanting to build, where they've been able to do it provided they sign up for time-bound consent. So essentially that is, you can build your house if you agree to remove it in 30 to 40 years, for example, and you agree not to sell it, and so forth.
Where is that happening? Is that within the RUO affected area?
It is actually. It's in, this case is in South Shore, as I understand it. When I get some more time, it's really good to go and actually interview these people to get their full story, but it's just sort of time. I see Jeff Butcher sitting in the audience here. He was one of our original presenters, so he's got a very interesting case, which I think is also quite indicative of where we might be going. And it's similar to this in terms of, but it's a little better, which I'll talk about soon. I think I'll just check. So, sort of brings us up to today. Actually, I might just go back to Jeff's case, if you don't mind, Jeff. So his case is where you're able to build, but when the sea rises 0.4 of a metre, then the houses will have to be removed. And just correct me if I got anything wrong, but I think that's it. So it's what's called an adaptive approach, and we've actually advocated for this. So rather than just saying the sea's going to rise a metre, we'll be precautionary, and you'll have to stop building now so that there's no houses in the way in 100 years' time, let's be adaptive about this. And basically, if you assume there's going to be a problem after a 0.4 metre of sea level rise, and there's enough time for people can safely live in an area for another 0.4 metre of sea level, let them. So it doesn't really matter what you think about the future of sea level rise, whether you think it's going to be 200 mils or 2 metres. It actually doesn't matter because you are measuring as you go along, and when the sea does rise to a point where it's dangerous, then you move, and that might be 20 years and it might be 200 years, you know. So we've moved to this sort of adaptive approach, and I'm not sure how that's going to go from a legal perspective, because there's a few sort of clashing issues of we won't go into that today about precaution. But yeah, so we are now in August 2020, and the Coastal Hazards Working Group was established, and actually Sarah's here tonight, and Mike as well, welcome, who are on that group, which is fantastic, so they might be able to talk a little bit as well. So the way I see council working is that the staff do a lot of the, sorry about that. The staff do a lot of the sort of legwork, all the research, the writing up, and then at the end the councillors sort of, after a lot of work and a lot of big documents, typically councillors will get to vote on A, B, C option, and one of them's a gimme. So, but this is oversimplifying it. But what we've got, no, I'm getting onto that. So, but what's happening this time is the working group is, what I'm seeing is that councillors are actually getting directly involved, which is quite different to the normal process of waiting to the end and voting A, B or C. And so, in essence, the council staff are presenting to councillors as they go along through this process, and we hope they're getting asked hard questions. So that started in August 2020, and they've had a number of presentations. There was a request, I think, from here and supported by CCRU that there be effective community representation on that group, which was turned down, but I still think it was a lost opportunity and a shame, but that's was the outcome. So, yeah, so in November, so the working group's established in August, then in November the adaptations planning process has started, where the working groups actually started to hear from staff, I'm guessing, and potentially experts, developing this plan. So this is the timeline I've been able to piece together, just so you kind of have a rough idea of how it might go. So mid-2020 was the scoping. So initially you've got an engineering phase, which is Tonkin Taylor are doing that, and it's being peer reviewed by, come to me in a minute, Jenkins. So initially there's a scoping phase, and that's been done, and there's actually a scoping document out, or the methodology has actually been done as well, and there's a methodology document that will be out. And so having a read of these documents would be worth us all doing as well, and I think one of our people is doing that, so we're looking forward to hearing back what he's got to say about it. Then the analytical phase is happening now, with reporting due back late 2021. So we should get a report from Tonkin Taylor, I'm thinking or guessing or hearing, sort of August, September, October. I'm not sure, you might be able to tell me more about that. And then the first stage of adaptive planning happening after that in early 2022, I think is the timeline. And that's sort of like, I would say for us, kind of quite unknown. What's that really going to look like? I understand it's going to be consultation with communities, and communities coming up with responses to how to deal with these problems. But how does that fit with council stance? Let's go back to what it was, which was, say, for example, non-compliance for certain things. If the community wants something, the council wants something else, then what? You know, it's sort of, there's a few question marks around that for me, at least anyway. The way it's going to work, it's going to be broken up into certain areas, starting with Littleton, Mount Herbert, and then coming around to Sumner, South Shore, down the track. Is that right? No?
Down the track at some point, but we've only identified
which is Littleton,
Sort of Teddington kind of area.
Teddington.
Yeah, so it's in that Littleton harbour, but it doesn't include Littleton.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, so
It's a small, very low-lying area.
yeah, so that's initially where this will start in early 2022. So yeah, look, it's a little bit looking from the outside at the moment. It's kind of a black box about what's happening in the working group and what's been presented. We've put in some OIA requests to try and find out. I personally think it would be better if this could be open. It's quite hard to talk to representatives about what's happening because you don't know, and quite hard for them. I don't know, maybe frustrating for them as well, I'm not sure, because you hear this information but you can't really engage with the community about it. I think there could be quite a good collaboration there. Anyway, we put in an OIA to try and get information about what was being presented to open it out a bit, but that was refused. So looking from the outside, we sort of hear concerns from the community, and today's about hearing, you know, what you think, and it's debating it. Some of them you might not even agree with, and that's fine as well. And just adding to that list. So yeah, this is, I would say, a summary. So coastal suburbs are being singled out, picked on. Hazards with higher likelihoods exist in other areas, and building is not being restricted is one. That's pretty common. That original slide I had before, it's sort of really linked to the first one, extreme scenarios stacked on top of each other, coupled with harsh restrictions. There's a view in council elements in it that coastal suburbs are doomed and need to be moved along. A view that influences policy development in a way that looks to withdrawal of investment rather than support or adaptivity. A sort of a sinking lid policy. I think it's probably more like the past. I don't think that that's the case now. I think the direction now very much is adaptation. Yeah, use of fast track process and lack of natural justice, I think was certainly a problem in the early days. Sort of conflict of interest where city councils are worried about risk, and you can reduce that risk with use of planning tools, but that doesn't sort of cost the council. It costs, you know, the cost is on the community, if you like. That's where that's coming from. Mentioned before, lack of community representation and critical voices in the working group. I think, yeah, like I say, there was a call for that before. Your working group behind closed doors and lack of meaningful inclusion, I think it's quite similar to each other. Yeah, experts are nameless, so and can't be questioned by the community, and whether that'll stay that way forever. Maybe when the report is released, they'll be available to be talked to. Yeah, and another one sort of similar to that, it's, I guess, a cynicism, I suppose. Decisions already made regardless of community suggestions, expert concerns. So there's a sort of, like I'd say, a summary of what we've heard, and yeah, would really encourage you guys to sort of ask questions and, yeah, tell us what you think. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
So, there's been quite a lot in the media recently, sort of nationally, so you know, across the whole of New Zealand, around some situations that have existed where there's been discussions about things being turned from freehold to leasehold, affecting people's insurance. So do you know what that's based in? Because if we're not at a stage now where any decisions are being made, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is the kind of discussion that's going around, but it's actually not based in anything as yet.
No, I guess people are speculating. I mean, that's kind of a little trouble. We're kind of in a place where we don't know anything much at the moment, so we're speculating. But I guess when you get a situation where you've got time-bound consents, you can build for a certain amount of time. I think that has some knock-on effects you need to think about. So if you can have your building on a piece of land for 30 to 40 years or for 0.4 metres of sea level rise, then it's I don't know if you can call that leasehold, but it's kind of time bound. It's lease, you know what I mean? Your lease is up. But what I'm going to get into is that what's a bank going to say about that? You know, if you go to lend money to build, can you actually pay it off by the time you have to go, kind of thing? There's possibly some things to think about there. I think insurance companies, the insurance arguments kind of puzzled me a bit, and I think it may mature, is that I can't really see the insurance problem myself, because the way insurance companies work is that they take a history of an event, actual history, like how many times have you flooded, how high, you know, and so forth, and they get a statistical model to work out the likelihood of flooding the following year, and they only insure you for 1 year into the future anyway, so their risk is only 1 year forward. So we're talking about hundreds of years here. So not insuring you doesn't make sense to me, but maybe I'm missing something. Yeah.
Well, I'd say you're missing something. My name's Jeff Butcher. I did a subdivision down Rocking Horse Road, had a bit of a discussion with the council, which we were not in a high flood hazard zone, but we were not allowed to subdivide, which was in contravention of the city plan, etc., etc. We finally were allowed to subdivide, provided the houses are removed after 0.41 metres of sea level rise. What's special about 0.41 is that's 50 years is, oh sorry.
No, that's all right, I got it for you.
The expectation is that that will happen in 50 years under their scenario, and they've modelled what will happen in various other things, and they think it's acceptable risk for people to live there. As regards insurance, we have tried to we're about to build a house down there, and I don't know what other people's experience has been, but because we are going to, under the Building Act, they will give us a building consent provided we allow something to go on the title saying that this is in a risky area, and 3 insurance companies have turned down our application for insurance during the build on the grounds that they only give you insurance during the build if they're going to insure it at the end. That is irrational in my view, so I completely share your point of view, Warwick. They've got a risk for 1 year, and the council's putting this thing on the title because they've got a risk for, almost indefinite. So I have no problem with the logic of the council wanting to put that risk on my title, and it's something that a future buyer would then be aware of. I think that's fine by me. But the insurers, who I have said, you have only got a risk for 1 year, they've said, but the council's put this is a risky thing on there. So your assumption that there is a rational insurance market, in my view, is not supported by the facts.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
And my experience, and that goes to work, as an economist, I did work in Queenstown, where the insurers walked away after 2 100-year floods, said we won't insure Central Queenstown. 10 years later, they were insuring Central Queenstown. Back in the 80s, early 90s, we had quite a bit of flooding in the Heathcote. The insurers said, we're not going to insure those properties which are flood prone. 5 years later, they were insuring them again. So they make decisions and they're not amenable to reason, in my opinion.
Yep.
Warwick, how do they measure this 0.4, the sea level rise? Is it standardised?
It's getting there.
And are they doing it now?
Yes, so sea level is actually quite a hard thing to measure because it's up and down all the time, a lot. And to actually get a statistically significant measurement of sea level rise, you've actually got to take a lot of years. 60, I understand, from a expert in Dunedin, Hannah, I think his name is. So otherwise, it's not statistically significant because it can be up 1 year, down the next. So what the council is doing is, in Jeff Butcher's case, they've taken a 20-year moving average. So
As measured by high tide at the
Bridge Street Bridge. And so I think there's still a few questions around that to dig in a little bit, because 20-year moving average is probably not enough to be statistically significant, but I'm not a statistician. So, but it's kind of getting there, and there are ways to do it along the lines of what's happening.
But not without a lot of time. There's no way to sort of start now I mean, you really need 50 years to start.
No, well, we've got 50 years. Lyttelton
Oh,
tide
okay.
gauge goes back 100 years. No, so we've got a lot of years.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is it rising now?
Yes.
If you use the 20-year moving average, would you see
Yeah.
it rising?
Yeah, so sea level rise historically, and this is a fertile area for debate, but it's a very critical one. So over the last 100 years, the average has been about, I think, 1.7 millimetres per year. Now, if you take a time from, say, now and go back 30 years, I think you actually get to 3 millimetres or 2.8 or something like that. But the thing about that 30 years is actually not statistically significant. It's just not a long enough time because such variability in sea level rise. And you can actually go back to the 30s and find the same slope. So we're also just waiting a couple, maybe 10 or 20 years to find out if this is actually a trend or not. And the science says, you know, it is. But we don't know until we get a bit more time. So that's sort of what makes it quite complex.
The question isn't it's more about how much, not whether it's in what direction it's going.
Yeah, so the real critical thing is acceleration.
Yeah.
Because
And the
if you
speed
think
of it.
about it, the assumption here is that there's going to be a metre by 2100. So when this came out, it was between the year 2000, if you take the year 2000 as a starting point, at 2100, 100 years, the sea will be a metre higher, right? So the sea's been rising at 1.4 millimetres a year. Do the simple maths, on average that's 10 millimetres a year. There's going to have to be a real dramatic acceleration to reach that metre by 2100, isn't there?
And
So-
anybody then worked backwards and said, well, the oceans all now have an extra metre, how much ice has gone? Because there can't be any ice left.
No, there is enough ice there. There's certainly enough ice, and if it all melted, there'd be more than a metre. But it doesn't. You can't just sort of melt ice immediately either, right? So
The global warming also means water expands.
yeah,
And so the oceans have expanded just through temperature increase
yeah,
and stuff.
yeah.
as
So
well. It's a range of things.
there's a whole vast amount of science in this, but yeah, expansion as you get water, expand, water gets bigger. So anyway, all this goes into the models.
And it
but-
varies around the world.
That as well. And it's really complicated because you can actually have if sea is falling in some parts of the world just because of global sort of current trends and weather trends. So basically water does get actually pulled from one place to the other, and they have these interdecadal oscillations where you have a trend of increasing. So if you can see you can actually see a case where, say, Lyttelton is increasing and somewhere on the coast of America is decreasing. It's simply because of this interdecadal trends, but the experts in this know all about this stuff. So that's why they use global averages, because if you use a global average, even if your sea is sinking at the moment, over time, it'll, you know what I mean? So there's a huge amount of variability in this actually. But when it comes to like moving your house along or being able to build a room, it's actually what's happening here is what matters. You know what I mean? So we really just need to measure what is happening here.
Warwick, I want to take you back to that graph you had of the chronology of the timeline, which finished by the comment that adaptation planning. And I want to bring it back to a local level, say for the people of Sumner and Redcliffs, and for South Shore, because excuse the pun, we're all in the same boat. From your perspective, when the reporting comes back in 2002, and we're speculating here, what sort of things do you imagine might come as a result of that adaptation planning, and what sort of impact might that have for the people in the coastal communities?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is when the Tonkin-Taylor report comes out in late 2021, what are we going to see in there, and what's the response expect that going to be. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and I know we're speculating. But,
Yeah.
I
So,
think probably that's
so I can tell you one thing about the Tongan-Taylor report, and that what they're doing, and I think it's actually quite good. And I don't know much about it because it's confidential, and I haven't been told. But I have been told this, and then this bit's not confidential. But basically, what they're doing, rather than just sort of modelling a metre sea level rise, they're modelling increments of 100 mils. So you can say, well, if this sea was 100 mils higher, this is what it's going to look like. If it's 400, so you can actually start, you'll have a slider, in fact, where you can go, okay, when it gets to 400, this is going to be the case. However, so essentially that's what it's going to look like. However, there's some other things in there that I think need to be thought about, and they all need sliders. It's incredibly complex. So this is why I think there needed to be, and there should be, if it possibly can, a bit more discussion on this. So it's not just about engineering and science, it's actually about policy and politics as well. So the sea level rise is one part of it, and you can actually deal with that quite well with this adaptability thing and say, look, if it rises half a metre, we need to move on. And look, you probably do. You know, if it was higher, you'd be, you know, it's just sort of straight engineering, isn't it? Unless you start to build seawalls and so forth. But that's part of the discussion as well. But there's things in here that are real policy questions. So look at the next one down, the 1 in 500 year flood event. It adds a lot of height to that water. And is it appropriate to use a 1 in 500 year flood event? You know, that's an awful big flood. And I don't even know how they get data for that. Like, who was keeping data 500 years ago? Maybe the scientists probably have a good answer for that. But is that the right number to be used? And we should be having that discussion. It shouldn't be just a policy thing that happens. There's other things in here like this 16% rainfall increase. Well, that may or may not happen. It may be more, it may be less. There's a few other levers in this that need an adaptive approach as well, and I don't know if that's happening or not. And so on and so on. So I think it's really important that we know about all the assumptions that have gone into this, to be able to have a proper discussion and be able to talk to politicians about what's actually appropriate in terms of like risk. Because if you think about it, if you take a metre sea level rise, the likelihood of that, the likelihood of 1 in 500, the likelihood of an increase, you add all these likelihoods together, you get an eye-wateringly small probability of something actually happening. And that's kind of what I was saying in the beginning about people feeling picked on. You've got such a hazard stack that at the end of it, you know, it's one in millions of chances of actually happening. And you can't, you've got a section that's good for grazing a goat because of it, you know. And that's the sort of the beef I think people have. Having said that, I think we are kind of progressing towards doing a better job, but we really don't know because it is still a black box. So get back to your question, at the end of it, I'm hoping we'll see what's in that report, I'm guessing, and the response to it, yeah, I suspect it's going to be a bit like what Jeff Butcher's had to sign up for, where you'll be allowed to build your house, maybe subdivide, provided you agree to move if the sea is half a metre higher or 0.4 higher. But I think that I'm hoping that's up for discussion. It's a good discussion to have.
I guess probably what I was perhaps more focused on was not so much the building of new homes, but where things are at for current residents in terms of living in Sumner, Redcliffs, wherever now, and the impact of things like insurance and increased annual premiums, because my understanding is the first thing that happens is that insurance premiums rise once insurance companies sniff a risk. The second thing that happens is with insurance is withdrawn, and for many people, well, for all people, sooner or later they're in a position where they have to sell their house. If they try to sell their house and they can't get insurance, That's it.
Yeah, so we've sort of covered the insurance thing as illogical but a fact. I actually think insurance companies will come to their senses. Someone will come in and go, hang on, there's an opportunity here. There's no more risk than there was last year. I'll insure you. Take your money, thanks very much, double the premium, you'll be happy to pay it. I actually sort of think they're taking an opportunity just to bump up premiums a bit. Because it just doesn't make sense, you know what I mean? There's one thing I will mention. I mentioned that commercial building got through the independent hearing panel as non-compliant. Now, if that happened in Sumner, it would be quite devastating because you've got the township right there. And what happens to the rest of the areas? There's kind of an inconsistency here. But I think Sumner would be very, very particularly impacted by that if what has happened over to your neighbours happens to you in this regard.
Just to clarify, the reports that are being done, are we saying out loud that those reports aren't going to be reports that we'll get to see?
Oh no,
as the
absolutely
public?
get to see them. We'll get to see them, and well, Sarah, I don't know if she can say anything, but the timeline is around. I think it's late this year. We're expecting the engineering report from Tonkin and Taylor. Now, we would really love to be able to talk to Tonkin and Taylor and have a look at what's going in, because with these models and the engineering, it's assumptions that go into them are really critical to the outcomes. But we haven't been able to achieve that and at this stage. But
So the point at which they will be available to the public is pre-decision making or post-decision making?
yes, pre-decision making, yeah.
Good.
Or is it helpful if I give a
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So Sarah actually is a regular attendee to our presentations, and it's great to have her along, so welcome.
Thanks, Warwick. Thank you so much for tuning out tonight, and sorry for being late. So, Mike and I are both on the working group, Coastal Hazards. Mike chairs it, and it's been absolutely fascinating. The first thing I have to acknowledge is that I'm not going to respond to a lot of the specific stuff. That's something that our council staff should do, and I know that Jane's been in touch with Charlie and is going to come to the next future Sumner meeting. Jane and Mike gave a fantastic presentation to the Warwick Residents Association AGM and talked about the program going forward, which was really good, and they'll do the same for Sumner as well. And that offer has been open to all the different communities, and they've been to a few different things. There are absolutely uncertainties. No one knows for sure exactly what's going to happen. But the key thing is that shouldn't stop us doing things. We need to take those uncertainties into account. Just like as individuals we do with our home insurance, we get insurance, we don't know that there's going to be a fire or whatever, because we want to take steps to mitigate any risk and to have something in place in case the worst happens. And what the council is responsible for doing is doing that on a citywide scale. And if you look at some poor examples of planning that was allowed, is things like, it was very clear after the earthquakes that there were some areas that council knew were prone to liquefaction, didn't want building on, there was court cases, subdivisions went on them, and everyone else said afterwards, why did you let people build there? And council has a legal responsibility to work on hazards and to help their communities avoid those hazards wherever possible. It's really, really, really not easy. The district planning process, the fast track stuff, was unhelpful, and we really, really want to do the upcoming stuff for coastal hazards and adaptation really well with communities. What Warwick didn't get as far as saying was the process that we've signed off on includes, once we've got all of that information, what we don't want to do, for example with the working group stuff, is have a whole pile of unfinished information out there that hasn't gone through a thorough process where people go, oh my god, look at that, when actually it's not quite right. So we're trying to get everything as accurate as possible, so that we don't unduly scare people or make people think that we don't know what we're doing, if you know what I mean. But there's going to be a really big citywide conversation that needs to happen about what these hazards are and potential ways of handling them. And part of what will feed into that is government direction that's coming. So the RMA is being reformed. They've got 3 new acts coming in. One of them is the Coastal Hazards Adaptation Act. And we don't know exactly what's going to be in there, but we do know that it will cover a range of things, including what councils will have to do in their district planning, as well as funding arrangements. Because at this stage, no one has any responsibility for funding any changes to protect private property, for example, from the hazards. So that government direction later this year is going to be absolutely crucial in helping us steer through that. One of the key things after that education space, and we'll be doing the first one with that low-lying area, so Teddington Governors Bay, is setting up a coastal panel, and each sort of community, you saw on one of the maps there that sort of divided into different kind of sections, and we'll work with communities. I think it was the multicoloured one there. We'll work with communities in different areas based on the risk profile, and the communities that might be more likely to be more at risk sooner will be talked with sooner. And we'll be setting up coastal panels where a group of residents who are in part selected by the community, in part by others, maybe the community will be involved, all of that kind of stuff, to talk through all of the evidence around the local geography, the expected changes, the potential changes, and to work through a series of different options with that group and a pilot of experts who they will be able to call on for information, site visits, a whole range of things over a series of meetings. And that coastal panel will be checking in with the community at different points as well. And then at the end of that, that group will make a recommendation to council on where to go. And I don't know if you want to have a look it up. I don't think you'll have seen the macro video, the Makara in Wellington. No, it's up on, I think, the MFE website, and it's a really good. It's one of the first times this process has been done in New Zealand, and the small coastal community of Makara outside of Wellington went through a coastal panel process, and there's a video of kind of how it happened. It was a couple of years ago now, and the community response to that. So that's a really interesting one. I think Jane will show it as part of her talk. But that's really good. So we really want to involve community. We need to have a really big discussion as a city, because while it is people's individual personal property, it's also the public realm. It's our beaches and our parks and our roads and a whole pile of public space as well as that.
So with this kind of sort of options, I suppose, they're going to be tailor-made for each area, because I think
areas differ hugely, and so it can't be one size fits all.
Okay, that I think I would. And the other thing I was going to ask is, after the earthquakes, and there were some blanket decisions made around people's life safety risk in their houses, but people who are on the sort of the fringe areas of it, like there's sort of a blanket, everything here is too unsafe to live in, and yet we had some situations over here where people could prove that they weren't actually affected by rock or for whatever reason. And I think what
changed over time.
What Warwick was saying around some of the measurements that have been taken around sea level rise, what factor into that actually makes quite a big difference at that top end.
Yeah, Jane will be able to talk about the future summer thing.
Yeah, so it's
and again, there will be uncertainties, and we do have to cater for those uncertainties, but do the best that we can in planning in the meantime. The process will look at trigger points rather than time frames. As Warwick said earlier, we don't know when things are going to happen. But we want to do that with the communities.
So looking at that sort of adaptive response, hopefully.
And actually, as you point out, Sumner's one of those communities on the coast that has already had the experience of, I guess, retreat, right? The areas were red zoned due to rockfall risk, quite different to the red zoning along the Avanotakato River, because this was, you know, rocks falling on people's homes, and yeah, so but what to do with.
Sorry. I was going to mention a couple of things that came to mind. Daryl mentioned insurance, and it is a fact, even though it makes no sense to me or Jeff. But I think the thing that could be a problem could be banks, because they do have a long-term problem, because you need to pay your mortgage off over, it's probably not 25 years anymore, is it? Like 40 years. And so I think the banks will be the thing to be worried about, actually. So you're buying up a place in Sumner, and I think there's just so many sort of like difficult angles when you start to think about this. An existing house, for example, to build a new house, okay, sure, build your house as long as you can move it out after a 0.4 of a metre of sea level rise. Now the bank's going to say, how long is that going to be, aren't they? Because they want you to pay off that loan before you have to move out. And so the whole sort of like these models come back into play. You know, what is likely is still not completely vanquished out of the equation because of that problem. So if council's saying, well, this is likely, it's a metre, they're going to go, God, you've only got 30 years. We're not loaning you money. So we haven't escaped this problem of projections yet, I don't think. So, and then you think, okay, the simple case is building on a site and moving a house, but what if you want to add a room to your house? All right, same thing. Do you have to, what do you do? Do you have to like chop the room off after 40? I mean, it doesn't make, there'll be so much complexity will come out of this, I think. Like, you know, you'll have existing use rights, hopefully, but existing use rights are very narrow, like really, and when on the non-compliance stage, that's what was proposed, they're extremely limiting. Like people who want, you know, to rebuild the house or make it bigger just can't, you know, and I actually bought a house and called the council and said, what if I want to lift it up to be, you know, new floor level? Said, no, that wouldn't fit within existing use rights. So planners can get pretty extreme about this. Yeah, I know, I thought the same. But yes, but that's what you actually get in reality, you know. So, yeah, what happens to existing stock under this arrangement where you kind of have to move after a certain amount of time, combined with the banks? The other things to talk about and think about, I think. Final other thing that came to my mind, completely different topic, is who would you like to hear from in the future? We do these each month. It takes a bit of work. So again, if anybody would like to get involved and help with it, people to talk to us. So I mentioned Jeff did one. It's a fantastic one. I recommend it, the economics of this whole thing. I'm thinking it would be really interesting to hear from the government. We've got this this retreat bill coming. It would be really interesting because I think this is going to somehow fold. They're not calling it anymore. They changed it. Oh, right. Waiting for that. Yeah, it was a sort of red rag for the bull. They used to call it the retreat bill, but now the adaptation bill is coming in. And one thing in that bill is the potential to lose existing use rights. I just think that needs to be really understood, and it would be really good to hear about that from somewhere in government or somebody. I've actually written to Porter Williams about it, or her assistant, but haven't heard back on that one. But that's one. There's been a couple of interesting reports. Neil's done one on the next 100 years of weather. There's another one on groundwater in the city. Would be really interesting to hear from those people as well. Yeah, it's quite scientific and technical, but we all love that, don't we? But all of that feeds into this policy, and it's really good to know about it, so you can actually have an intelligent conversation when it comes to talking about it down the track.
One of the presentations that we had was about what the city's overall view of rising waters in general, because obviously it's not just along the coast that affects. Our water table could be affected in general across the city. Obviously, our city's sewer department is very close to where water is rising, might make a difference to how that all functions. I don't know, but the city's overall policy about what would that be might be an overarching view, like he was talking about water absorption, the Amsterdam thing, how is the city's philosophy across this going to operate? And do you see that kind of conversation? Obviously, the individual areas need to be engaged to figure it out, but in general, the overview, or is that something coming from the national perspective?
That living with water thing, and that's absolutely a conversation that Christchurch needs to have. It's a long-term issue, and the more immediate stuff is doing the coastal planning, but it's definitely an issue, a conversation we need to have.
The thing about groundwater and sea level rise is that as you go further inland, there's less impact on groundwater levels. So certainly when you take a sea level rise scenario, coastal are more impacted, and it's certainly one of the things I think we'll see in this report. But having said that, there are some areas in the city that have got very high groundwater and they can still build their houses. So I think there needs to be, again, it's going back to the being picked on kind of thing. If it's going to be within half a metre of here, then are we being treated in a similar way to anywhere else that's got high groundwater out in, Merivale and Fendleton and so forth?
I think that makes a lot of sense, but also taking a bit of perspective on some of the causes of the scenarios that we're looking at, and how our own behaviours and how we can mitigate by making changes, even though they may not have an immediate impact on those scenarios. But the situation we're in now is because of 100 years of industrialisation, and it's had an impact. So I think we need to think about our own individual capacity to adapt as well, our own behaviours and our lifestyles, which is obviously something we have to make a decision about.
And you can actually do a lot of that at no cost and a lot of benefit. There's,
that's right.
Generating
Because
your own
often we
power and stuff like that.
outsource this problem to others. So what are the council doing about it? What are the government doing about it? What are others doing about it? In fact, we are individually responsible in some degree for the situation we're in.
Yes.
And we can change our behaviour.
I think that goes without question. There's another interesting point that Sarah brought up one of our meetings that I think is a really good one, is that there's kind of grumbles about, you hear in the papers from the other parts of the city, we're not paying for them on the coast there, and what are they living over there for, And there's a few kind of points about that. And one of them is that we didn't actually create this problem alone. It's the whole of society, and coastal shouldn't be allowed shouldn't be having to bear the cost by itself, because they're the ones really paying. So the other one I sort of have harped on about for a while is sort of the social contract. So what kind of community or city do we want to live in? We actually sort of want to look after each other. And we happily pay for the flood walls along the Waimak, so Western Christchurch won't get flooded in a 1 in a 500 year event, actually. It's actually about we're insuring each other in a way. So we have to sort of take that perspective a little bit and think about the social contract. We pay into rates, and we're all taking care of each other's backs to an extent. Where that extent is an interesting debate by itself, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, actually, and the rest of the city needs to think a little about those 2 points as well.
So I was going to say thanks everyone for coming. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of final points. So I want to thank you very much for coming along and speaking to us. So the Residents Association, we decided we wanted to sort of bring Warwick and the group over here to speak. I think it's a really important conversation to be having. What we've got to remember is it's a natural phenomenon. It's something that's going to happen, so it's good to be prepared. And just to keep in contact with us, keep in contact with CCRU. I think really we kind of need the voice for community adaptation or response to come from the community. So if you have capacity to support CCRU, come and speak to me. I think that's probably the best way forward. we've got quite a lot of information that's going to be coming out before the end of the year, and if you could just keep yourself, you know, informed if you want to be, share the information with people, and and that's probably our best way forward, really, I think.
And I'd
So
say,
thank you very much.
please come along to us annual events, well, if you want a lot more
Yeah.
details around.
Oh, yeah, and we
what's
will
coming
do-
through as well. So
And we'll be doing
yeah.
a bigger meeting with Jane, who's going to come along and speak, and Warwick will come back and speak, so we can do a wider presentation, with, hopefully with what we're able to speak to about the coastal hazard groups. And thank you, Sarah and Mike, for coming along.
And Chris, thank you for hosting us, appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Glad we've been, you've